Alright, let's get started. Thank you for checking out this video. It's the first in a series we're putting together called Ham Radio 101 for the Prepared. Kind of a crash course, if you will, for uh, amateur radio for people who are into prepping and self-sustaining and all that kind of stuff. So this will be a long one. Follow-up videos will be much shorter, but this one's going to cover, I'm going to touch base on quite a few topics, so this video will probably be about a half hour long. I apologize. All future videos will be much shorter and more detailed, so let's just get going. Topic of this one is so you bought Baofeng, now what? These Chinese radios have been available for some time now. They're 20-30 bucks online, and a lot of people who are self-reliant or preparedness minded have been snatching these things up as a good backup for communications, which they are. But a lot of people, including myself, when I first started in the ham radio, bought one thinking it'd be pretty much like a walkie-talkie, and then realizing there's much more to it. So let's get into what all that is. In this video, we're going to touch on a couple topics here: the different types of ham radios, how ham radio fits into being prepared, what kind of ranges you can expect to get from a radio, touch base a little bit on antennas, simplex communication and using repeaters, considerations you should have if the grid goes down, ideas for practicing with your radio, and considerations specific to team and groups. So let's dive in. There are basically two types of ham radio, amateur radio, that we use based off of the frequencies and how they're grouped into bands. There is the HF, which is the high frequency bands, and then the VHF, UHF, which is the very high frequency and ultra high frequency bands. The HF is your stereotypical radio that most people think of, a big box of knobs and levers and buttons and dials where somebody can pull a voice out of the static. And these, you can get the ranges from local to halfway around the world. Some of them, like the one pictured here, is your typical base station. This one uses about 100 watts of power to transmit. They can get up to 1500 watts, but there's really no need for that. Those are very expensive, not portable. I'd say a vast majority of the people you'll hear on the air are using a 100-watt rig. And then they can also be they can be downright portable. Small rigs, they are called QRP, will use as little as 5 watts of power, but those things are man portable. You can put them in a backpack and go wherever you want with them. Ideally, I would recommend for like a neighborhood watch preparedness group, family unit, mutual assistance group, whatever you want to call yourselves. It'd be nice to have one or two people in the group that are capable of using this type of radio for strategic purposes, I would say. These are good for regional and beyond communications. So say you're in an area that was hit by a earthquake or a tornado and you want to be able to communicate to people outside of that range, several hundred miles away, to see if how things are affected in their area, if people and supplies are on their way to help you out, that kind of thing. And now the more common, and probably what you bought into to get started, is the VHF, UHF. A lot of these are the handheld type, the handheld transceiver, typically called by hams handy talkies, HTs, walkie-talkie, whatever you want to call it. Your Baofengs are in this category. They transmit and receive they transmit and receive on the VHF, UHF bands, most typically 2 meters and 70 centimeters. And in this range, you'll also find bands that are used by public and private entities, such as police, fire, municipalities, utilities. This type of radio is a little more tactical than an HF, mainly because they're so portable. The small handheld types, you can have one on your belt or in your backpack or whatever. Takes up little weight. Very quick communications to people that are nearby. And nearby, I mean several yards away to over 100 miles away, depending on a lot of factors. The handhelds, there are 5 to 10 watts of power, but then you can get it to a little bit larger rigs that are still portable. These will be, typically the size of your classic CB radio. Many people use them as a base station. Many people use them, obviously, in their vehicles or even in a pack. The advantage of these radios is that they transmit on more power, typically around 50 watts, so that will allow you to reach out much farther. And then you can have the base stations, which will look just like the HF base stations. 50 to 100 watts are typical with those. Now, this radio is good for local and regional comms. Like I said, from yards away to 100 miles away. More, like I said, more of a tactical use for what's going on in your immediate area. Use a natural disaster example again. If there's, hurricane that came through, you can figure out who has power, who doesn't, what roads are blocked with trees, who needs help, who doesn't, where our supplies are, etc., etc. So I would recommend that everybody in a team have this capability. So now on to the meat and potatoes of this. How ham radio fits in with preparedness. It's an ideal communications tool. You're not dependent on infrastructure. You don't need grid power. You don't need service providers. You just need a radio and somebody else within range that has a radio that can hear you. Mobile phones, internet, even satellite phones are all dependent on infrastructure. The satellite phone that you may have is an awesome device, but there's a service provider behind it. That service provider may be shut down or taken offline, either by the disaster or by the government. That's a real possibility that they may, for some national security reasons or whatever, they may shut your phone off or coverage in your area. You know what I mean? So a ham radio will work in areas with no cell signal. You don't need any towers. Again, it's just, you can be as simple as one radio to another. The inexpensive handhelds, like the Chinese radios and stuff, ranging from $20 to $75, it's fairly affordable to stock up on a couple of those, so there's no reason why you can't have one and kept all the time in every vehicle you have, in your everyday carry bags, where it's a backpack or purse or man purse or whatever, in your emergency bags, your go home bags, your get out bags, your what have you, whatever you want to call them, and even have a couple laying around the house or at work. At work, you can keep one in your desk drawer, in your locker, in your toolbox, whatever. You can have a little portable radio anywhere you want. Although there is some limitations with the radios, and that is they're really not magic. Range is affected on many things, mainly the terrain, the power of the radio, and the antenna. Again, these handhelds are all line of sight, so if you're in a building, you're going to get some pretty lousy coverage, especially a metal building. And in some cases, these things aren't any better than the FRS radios you can buy at Walmart or Cabela's or whatever box store you go to. And sometimes atmospheric conditions will play a role. Not too much with the VHF, UHF, but they play a drastic role with HF, as far as how the ionosphere is playing. We'll get into that a little bit more later. So antennas, that's, in my opinion, is the most important thing on the radio. Highly recommend upgrading from the stock antenna that came with your radio, whether it's the cheap Chinese ones or you spend a lot of money for a Yaesu or a Kenwood or what have you. Get a better antenna. Still hang on to that rubber duck that came with it. That can be useful for other reasons, but always have a spare. But it's important to get a little better antenna. Handhelds, you can buy them off the shelf for $20. That'll greatly improve your range. And then, as you can see in this picture here to the left of the handheld, that is a roll-up J-pole antenna and a 10-foot length of coax cable. So that roll-up antenna is about 6 feet long in itself. So what I can do is I can throw a string through a tree, hoist that up, and quickly plug it into the handheld, and then I gain the height and to get that antenna up a little higher to extend the range with the line of sight, and then also with a higher gain antenna, I can really improve my signal. One thing to keep an eye on, it's not so much of a problem with the handhelds, but a poorly matched antenna, meaning that it isn't quite resonant on that frequency, can damage your radio. This is more of a factor of HF rigs, but it's something still to keep in mind. So, as I touched on earlier, height is might. Getting up in the higher elevations in the terrain will help your signal. So if you're in a valley and you're not reaching out to anybody, climb out of that valley, get up on top of the hill. And that's the reason why repeaters are on top of hills and tall buildings, so they can get the improved line of sight. But before we get into the repeaters, let's talk about SIMPLEX. SIMPLEX is the type of communicating or working your radio that is just strictly radio to radio. Think like a walkie-talkie or a CB. Same thing, there's nothing in between, just you to that person. That's how HF mostly works. There is some repeaters for HF, but they're few and far between. Probably 95% of all communications with HF is done by SIMPLEX communication, and in their case, you're using the propagation of bouncing your signal off the ionosphere. Think of it as a bank shot and pool, and your signal is the cue ball, and the ionosphere is the bank on the table, and you're trying to hit another station, which is the object ball. Only with ham radio, you can't see the object ball, and you can't see the bank, and the bank is moving up and down, and sometimes it just plain disappears. So that's kind of the magic of HF radio, is you got a lot of factors to figure out without a lot of visible aids. So it's where a lot of practice comes in, but we'll touch more on that later. So key to HF, again, is pretty much angle, or your antenna, the type of antenna, the angle it's at, direction it's at, all that kind of stuff. UHF, VHF, SIMPLEX, that's a little more straightforward. It's line of sight, so basically getting up where the other antenna can see your antenna. Not necessarily visibly, but you know what I mean with the wavelength going. So, keys to SIMPLEX: terrain, antenna, and power. That's why I recommend that people have a mobile radio in your vehicle if you can. You get 10 times as much power to transmit with. You can get a little better antenna, and of course you're mobile, so it's something to consider. But also what extends the range of VHF is the use of repeaters. Repeaters are basically just an automated station. They have an antenna on a tower, typically on hills or buildings, and all it does is just repeat a transmission with an improved signal. These things will run 25, 50, maybe 100 watts. They have a much more sensitive antenna than what you have on your handheld and most likely your mobile or base station. And all it does is it takes in your signal and, as the name implies, it repeats it. So if you look at this graph on the right side of the slide here, that was created by K0VAB, is a good illustration of how line of sight works, where you got the two radios on either side of that mountain. They can't physically see each other, but on top of that mountain, they can see that repeater tower. So the signal goes from one radio to that repeater. The repeater rebroadcast it out at a stronger signal at a higher elevation, and it can be reached by the other radio. So as I'll go in more detail in a whole video on repeaters because there's a lot to cover. But basically, not only the repeaters can extend range that way, you can link repeaters together either by a radio signal or internet. So that way you can extend range regionally or even worldwide if you go through the internet. Repeaters can be semi-private by limiting access. A lot of repeaters work by when you transmit to them, you're also transmitting in a sub-audible tone that the repeater hears. And when it hears that tone, it will accept your signal and rebroadcast it. If you don't know that tone, you're basically ignored by the repeater. So you can make a repeater semi-private by restricting who knows that tone that you have to hit. This can be very useful for emergency reasons where you want to set up a search and rescue or whatever type group. You can set it up where you can cut down the traffic where only people who you need to communicate with will be able to hear you on that repeater. Now, repeaters are pretty much exclusively owned by private individuals or radio clubs. So they have some beefed up features to help them out in a blackout or a grid down situation, since a lot of people who are in the ham radio are a little bit prepared minded by a default. So a lot of times they'll have a battery backup or different operation modes that they can use to be more efficient on power. So when the grid goes down, often the repeaters will still function. But keep in mind that repeaters, even if they do have a backup power, whether it's a battery bank or a generator of some sort, there is a chance that they will go down long term. So that's why it's important to be able to be strong with your simplex skills, know your area quite well, as far as where you can't reach people, and do things to extend the life of your battery. Now the radios, of course, use a much more power when they're transmitting. They hardly use any power when they're receiving, so keep your calls to a minimum. And to extend things longer, you can even turn them off and only have them on a schedule. You can check out the Wilderness Protocol online. That's a good example of a way to conserve your battery life for the long term. And then also just simply having ways to recharge your battery. Having spare batteries for the handheld itself, having a larger battery bank in your house that you can plug your charger into, and of course, if you can, have some type of a power generation system to replenish all your batteries. Solar, fuel power generators, that kind of thing. And most importantly, and we get into what I really want to touch base on is don't wait for the grid to go down. Don't wait for emergency. Practice with your radios in your gear now. All right, so let's talk about practice. Practice is required to get the most out of the radio. You can't just buy a radio, program a few repeaters into it, turn it off, put it on a shelf, and think you'd be ready to go. It's much like the example I like to use is buying a ferrocerium fire starter, taking out the package, striking a few times, making some sparks, and then throw it in a bag saying, all right, I can start a fire. You really need to hone your skills and be familiar with the radio. What power settings to use to get your signal where it needs to be, but yet quiet enough so that people that you don't want to hear won't hear you. Programming repeaters, all that kind of stuff. Setting up antennas, etc., etc. And also need to prove out all your gear, not just your radio. Good example will be like that roll-up J-pole antenna. Does it work well? Do you have the right connectors to connect it to your radio? Do you have spares in case you lose one? and all that kind of stuff. So improving out your gear, improving your skills is crucial to get the most out of your radio and to be as an effective radio operator as you possibly can when you need to be an effective radio operator in an emergency. So there are several activities that you can use to sharpen your skill. The most basic would be tuning into the club repeater nets. As I mentioned before, most repeaters are operated by a radio club, and typically they have a weekly net, maybe even a daily net. To start off, just tune into that. Listen to them, see how their protocol works as far as controlling the net, when people talk, what they say, how they say it. Then once you get your license, join in on those nets, and then you can get immediate feedback on how you're sounding. You may get some advice on how to adjust your radio to get the optimum performance out of it. Some advanced stuff you can do is summits on the air or parks on the air, mostly known as SOTA and POTA. I have gotten really into the hobby of summits on the air. It's basically what you can see with the picture there is you take a small portable HF rig and you go to a hilltop or a mountaintop, set up your gear, and try to make as many contacts as you can. So this is fantastic practice on being man portable. It helps you out thinking with logistics and what to bring, how to bring it, and a lot of practice on setting up your antenna and everything. So those are some activities you should really look into. Since you're on YouTube, do a search for some of the SOTA activation videos. There's some pretty good ones out there. So of course, to get those things, you need to do is to get a license. It's really worth the effort. You need a license to legally transmit, and then you get access to the radio clubs. Where you're at a radio club, you can get access to knowledge from people that know what they're doing already. You'll meet people and you can network with them. You find like-minded people, people that have the same radios as you do, so they can show you how to set it up properly, and a lot easier than just scrounging on YouTube or going through the manual. You can also get access to legitimate emergency comms training through organizations like Aries, Races, Skywarn, etc. And the entry level license is pretty simple. I'll cover that in the next series of slides. And then the other thing you gotta do is be able to work with your team or group's specific considerations. So this will be a subject of another video as well. If you notice, this is the first time I use bold in any of the slides. If you wouldn't say it out loud in public, don't say it on the radio, because anyone can hear you, and they can also be located by your transmissions. So you want to make sure you do things to not raise any suspicion or cause any unneeded drama, I should say. Possibly trauma in the wrong case scenario, I guess. At any rate, not using real call signs will raise suspicions. And of course, avoid obvious code words and phrases. There's no use for the chairs against the wall or the eagle flies at midnight. And under some circumstances, avoid using names of people, locations, topics. You want to keep your conversations private and respect the privacy of others. So other tips to keep things private when needed is keep your comms brief. Only get on the radio when you need to, say what you need to, and get off. Less you're on, the less curious ears will follow you around. Speaking of following you around, change the frequencies during the conversation. Start off at one frequency, and then after back and forth, you go to a different one. Or you can even do split frequency comms, where one person is talking on one frequency and listening to another one, and the person you're talking to is doing the opposite. So that way, if anyone's listening in, they only hear half the conversation. But all that kind of comes down to having a quote-unquote band plan of frequencies for your group. When and where to use specific frequencies are saved as memory channels. Like if there's an event that happens, what frequency do you tune to get in first contact with everybody, and so on and so forth. So we're closing into a half hour, so let's just wrap this up. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. I know the quality isn't that great. This is a one take video, so you get what you get. Hopefully you got some information out of it that you'll find useful, and you'll check out the rest of the series. Thank you, and we'll catch you later.